Joining me now is our team of reporters. Mike Memoli is in New York, Matt Bradley in Beirut, Courtney Kube is at the Pentagon, and I'm also joined by NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell. So, Mike, let's start with you. Talk to us. How was President Biden's speech received by world leaders? This, of course, his final address to the UN General Assembly.
Well, of course, this is a different kind of room than the president might have been spending his time on most of this fall, obviously, rather than the campaign trail. Speaking to an audience full of fellow world leaders, the kind of audience he's been speaking to as vice president, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee for years. I thought it was interesting. One of the first real ovations response from the audience was the laugh from when he began by really addressing the elephant in the room, his longtime service, his age, joking that he was still 40 years old. He knows he looks 40 years old. I thought, though, it was striking, though, the applause lines we did hear. The first real major one had to do with the war in Ukraine, as President Biden framed this as a moment of choice. Are we going to stand by Ukraine against Russian aggression, or will we walk away? I know my choice. And then, notably, invoked the name of his vice president, Kamala Harris, during that part of the speech, the first time he's done so in any of his addresses to the UN over the last 4 years. He also received applause for talking about the actions he's taken to address climate change. I think the real question, though, beyond what we heard in the room, is how much are these world leaders listening to him? What was sort of almost a professorial dissertation about his worldview, his approach to foreign policy, versus how much are they expressing concern and really hedging their bets? We see the vice president, as well as former President Trump, are meeting with some of the world leaders who are also spending time at the UN.
And, Mike, today's speech comes at a time of global turmoil. We have wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. Is there any sense that we could see movement on the diplomatic front in either conflict, especially because we are so close to an election?
Well, the president and his team are very fond at this point of quoting George Mitchell, former Senate Majority Leader, longtime diplomat, and saying, you have 1,000 days of failure before 1 day of success. His team, as he has put it, has been tireless in trying to reach a ceasefire agreement, a hostage deal. They are committed to try to do so. Of course, the election calendar here may be influencing Prime Minister Netanyahu, who obviously has looked at a potential return to Donald Trump as something he might favor. And so I think the team believes that there might be an opening after the election, depending on the result, of course. But as we have often seen, a lame duck president in that transition period sometimes has more room to maneuver and more freedom and more receptive audience overseas to get big things done. That's certainly the hope inside the White House.
Okay, Mike Memoli from the UN General Assembly in New York. Mike, thanks for that. Let's go now to Matt Bradley, and we'll turn to you, where there have been more strikes in Beirut overnight. What have you been seeing and hearing on the ground there?
Yeah, well, what we're hearing here in Beirut is a world away from what we're seeing on those images in southern Lebanon. Now, here, we're not really seeing a lot of the violence that we're seeing in southern Lebanon, but there has been 2 strikes in as many days on the southern southern Beirut neighborhoods of Roberi, which was one just today. There was also Dahia yesterday that struck and killed, according to the Israelis, 2 senior Hezbollah officials and several of their top lieutenants. The one today, which struck a 6-story building in Roberi, this killed at least 5 people, according to Lebanese health authorities, and injured many more. So this is consistent with the Israelis' habit of trying to sort of decapitate Hezbollah. And this has been ongoing. You know, a lot of the violence that we're seeing in the south, as you mentioned, has been killing really, we've been talking about how it's the most for the past 20 years, ever since the 2006 war, in a single day. But nearly 500 people, or excuse me, over 500 people were killed yesterday. That really is more probably than we saw back in that 2006 war, where we saw more than double that amount killed in an entire month. And just to put it in context, 500 people killed, that's the amount of people, about the number, that were killed ever since this whole latest conflict started back on October 7th. So this was a major, here in Lebanon, this was a major escalation in just the past 2 days. And it's one that is going to have a searing impact on Hezbollah and their calculations on whether or not they're going to be launching reprisals. They've already been firing projectiles over the border into Israel at a furious pace. But really, remember that this comes a week after so many of their commandos were struck with these pager attacks, these walkie-talkie attacks that maimed hundreds, thousands of them. And this really has set this group in disarray. And this was thought to be one of the most organized paramilitary organizations in the entire Middle East. Now they really are on the back foot. They've been losing their leadership. They've now been losing a lot of their military installations, their rank and file, and a lot of their confidence. And that really is going to have an effect on how they calculate what's going forward. We just heard from Axios reported, and we haven't verified this, saying that Hezbollah has reached out to the Iranians. And this was quoting Israeli officials and American officials saying that they were reaching out to the Iranians, asking them whether Iran could pitch in and help against Israel. Iran refused. And that's just a metric of the desperation that we're seeing on the part of Hezbollah.
And there's also reports that the IDF claims that it killed a senior commander in Beirut today. Talk to us about who this is and what Hezbollah is saying about it.
Yeah, this is, again, the second such killing in as many days. This is Ibrahim Kube, and this was, according to the IDF, one of the senior commanders of Hezbollah's missile project. They're basically one of the main guys in charge of launching missiles by Hezbollah into Israel. And this is a man, again, according to the IDF, who had been promoted in the past couple of weeks because there have been so many assassinations of top-level Hezbollah officials by the Israelis. So the Israelis had said that this man was responsible for a lot of the projectiles that have been fired into northern Israel. So again, this is consistent with what we've been seeing the Israelis doing time and time again, attacking top leadership to try to kind of decapitate Hezbollah. Obviously, these ranks get filled once again, but this is in the full froth of what is looking increasingly like a new front in this war between Israel and Hezbollah, and it will again have a major impact on Hezbollah's calculations going forward. Ryan.
Okay, Matt Bradley for us in Beirut. Thank you, Matt. Let's go now to Courtney Kube at the Pentagon. How much was the American military brass aware of Israel's plan to expand its aerial assaults on Lebanon? And what are officials telling you about the possibility that we could see a ground war?
Yeah, so this is one thing that we've been pretty struck by, is how the U.S. has not had a good sense of the specifics of what Israel is really planning to do here. Now, of course, the IDF, as we heard from Matt, and we've been hearing for the past several days, have been somewhat public about their strategic goals here. But beyond those public pronouncements, here in the Pentagon, the U.S. doesn't have a strong sense of exactly what the details are. We heard a little bit about that last week when U.S. officials were saying that, yes, they believe that Israel was behind those pager attacks, but that the U.S. did not have a heads up on exactly what Israel was planning there. So the same exact theme has moved into this potential, or this ongoing fighting back and forth between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel this week. Now, as far as a ground campaign, the IDF have moved some forces north to be ready to prepare for a possible ground offensive, but the U.S. still doesn't have much of a sense of if or when that actually could happen. Again, the Israelis not sharing details about that. The U.S. instead is looking for indicators of a possible ground offensive. So things that they might look for, like a large number of Israeli reservists being called up to active duty, or even something very obvious like columns of Israeli tanks moving north towards the border. At this point, Pentagon and defense officials who we've spoken with have said, look, we're looking for the same kind of indicators that we look for in other cases of military buildups that could indicate a ground offensive. At this point, they are not seeing that, but there is a sense that that sort of a ground buildup could happen relatively quickly in a matter of days or weeks as opposed to months, Ryan.
And we, of course, know about President Biden's relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's been frosty, perhaps tense at times. Is it the same at the military level? What kind of conversations are happening between Secretary Austin and his Israeli counterpart?
Well, they're definitely frequent, and that also extends to the conversations that happen between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs here, General C.Q. Brown, and his counterpart. They talk on the phone quite often. They even meet in person occasionally. So the military-to-military communications are continuing. It's just the fidelity or the level of detail that seems to have changed when you look back to October 7th, when you'll recall there were actually U.S. military leaders, generals, and officials who were on the ground in Israel who seemed to be involved, or at least very aware of the planning process by the Israeli Defense Forces before they moved into Gaza with a ground offensive. That does not seem to be the case here anymore, Ryan. The relationship definitely has been shifting. But I think military officials, especially here in the Pentagon, would say, look, they still have a good communication with the Israelis. It's just not at that same level of detail. I will say that is pretty consistent over years, though. Look to something like Syria. The Israelis have conducted hundreds of airstrikes in Syria over the years, particularly targeting Hezbollah and forces there in Syria and advanced component parts of weapons that might move through Syria that could ultimately threaten Israel. In the majority of the cases of those strikes, which I will say the Israelis rarely acknowledge to be them, they'll give the U.S. a heads up because there are American forces in the region, but it's very last minute, and they won't give them details about what exactly they're doing, just that they're carrying out some sort of a military mission there. It's an exchange of information that's really more for the safety and security of a force like the U.S. military, Ryan.
Okay, Courtney Kube, thank you for that. We appreciate it. Let's go to Andrea now. And Andrea, you spoke with the vice president of Iran. What did he tell you about this latest escalation and whether Iran could still retaliate?
He did not rule out retaliation. Everyone wants to know whether or not Iran, the major player in this drama, the other shoe that hasn't dropped, is going to retaliate. There have been, from their point of view, a lot of provocations, particularly the assassination of the Hamas political leader in Tehran, in their capital, on the day of the presidential inauguration, their inauguration, this new team coming in. They describe themselves as reformers, not in our context or the rest of the world's, but they are more moderate than their predecessors. They say they want to reach out, they want to give women more rights. And on foreign policy, they say they were looking for a ceasefire, one that has not come about. They see this as a retaliation. They don't blame Hamas, of course, for blocking the ceasefire. They blame everything on Israel. And when I asked him specifically about whether they were going to strike back, here's how that exchange went. Would you rule out retaliating for the attack that killed Hamas's political leader in your capital on the inauguration of your president?
Well, that was clearly an act of state terrorism and a clear violation of our sovereignty and our territorial integrity. We were asked by the international community to exercise restraint in order to bring about an end to the war in Gaza. Unfortunately, that promise has never materialized.
You won't rule out retaliating?
No, we have said that we will respond in a manner of our choosing.
But so far, they have not struck back. They do have huge influence, of course, on their proxies. They deny that they are their proxies. But Hezbollah is their insurance policy there in Lebanon. And Hezbollah so far has not used all of its weapons. That is the big fear, that Hezbollah, with 100,000-plus missiles, will strike Israel, and that Israel will go in on the ground. And the big argument right now, as you know, is that Israel is no longer giving the United States, its closest ally, a heads up on its intentions.
Yeah, and well, let's talk about the big picture now. Whoever wins the presidential contest here in November is going to have to deal with these conflicts. How does the next president handle these continued challenges?
I mean, that is the huge problem, and the fact that there are two wars going on, one in Europe, one in the Middle East right now. Either one could expand, could inflame the region, and those are the challenges that leaders here at the United Nations are really facing. That is overshadowing everything else that's happening. There are two camps. The Europeans are, to a large part, worried about Donald Trump. They feel that he will either pressure Ukraine into giving territory back to Vladimir Putin or not be critical enough of Putin. So Eastern Europe feels threatened. All of NATO talks about this at every conference I attend. Of course, the British and the French as well. On the other hand, the Arab world, the Persian Gulf, has always trusted the Trump State Department, Trump negotiators, Donald Trump himself, whom they see as transactional. And so has Netanyahu. And there's a lot of belief in Israel among his critics and elsewhere that Netanyahu has been holding out all along for Donald Trump to be reelected, to get in power and to be able to put more pressure on the Palestinians and oppose a Palestinian state and agree to normalization with Saudi Arabia, which of course is the last part of the Abraham Accords that Donald Trump did start, but that as far as normalization with the Palestinians, that there'll be no future for them under Donald Trump.
A lot to talk about on a very busy day. Andrea Mitchell, thank you as always for bringing us your expertise.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.